The courtroom buzzed with a low, restless energy, a mix of murmurs, shuffling papers, and the faint hum of the old ceiling fan that never quite drowned out the tension. Judge Marcus Hill sat tall behind the heavy oak bench, his black robe neat, his expression measured. He had worn that same mask of calm for over a decade, through murder trials, custody battles, and endless pleas. Justice had to look steady, even when the world around it trembled. He glanced at the docket before him. State of Georgia vs. Derek Coleman. A routine case on paper. Armed robbery, second degree. The defendant had been caught near the scene with a bag of stolen goods, at least according to the report. Marcus expected another straightforward proceeding, another life to measure by evidence and law. He adjusted his glasses, tapped his pen once against the file, and nodded to the bailiff. Bring in the defendant. The double doors creaked open, and a hush fell over the courtroom. Two officers escorted a man in handcuffs toward the defendant's table. Marcus didn't look up immediately. He was scanning the charges again, but the sound of the man's steps caught his attention. Slow, uneven, not defiant, not frightened. Just tired. When Marcus finally lifted his gaze, his hand froze midair. The face across the room hit him like a memory he hadn't been ready for. The years had changed him. Older now, leaner, rough around the edges, but those eyes were unmistakable. Derek Coleman. The name on the paper suddenly wasn't just ink. It was the same Derek who'd shared his lunch in the 4th grade when Marcus forgot his own. The boy who used to run barefoot through the dusty backstreets of their old neighborhood, who'd taught him how to throw a perfect spiral with a beat-up football. The boy who once stood between him and a group of older kids who thought a quiet, bookish child was an easy target. Marcus's throat tightened. He forced his expression into stillness, though his pulse had doubled. The courtroom around him blurred for a moment. The bailiff's voice broke through the haze. Defendant, please state your full name for the record. Derek James Coleman, came the reply, steady but hollow. That voice, deeper now, roughened by time and hardship, still carried a trace of the warmth Marcus remembered. Derek didn't look at the judge yet. His gaze stayed low, fixed on the table before him. Marcus took a slow breath. Mr. Coleman, you are charged with armed robbery in the 2nd degree. Do you have representation? Yes, Your Honor, the public defender replied, a young woman clutching a folder too thin for comfort. Marcus nodded and continued the formalities, though each word felt strange in his mouth. He had long trained himself to separate man from memory, to treat every defendant as a case, not a person. But how do you do that when the man once sat beside you on a cracked front porch, talking about how one day you'd both make it out? His mind flickered back to their last day together, senior year. Derek hadn't shown up to graduation. Rumors said he'd gotten into trouble with the wrong crowd, that he'd dropped out to help his mother pay rent. Marcus remembered waiting for him by the school gate, holding 2 graduation caps, one in each hand. He'd waited until dusk. Derek never came. Now here he was, 15 years later, standing in a courtroom, wrists bound in cold metal. Marcus cleared his throat. Mr. Coleman, do you understand the charges brought against you? Yes, Your Honor. The eyes finally met. It lasted barely a heartbeat, but in that instant, the air in the courtroom shifted. Derek's expression flickered from confusion to disbelief. Recognition passed silently between them, a spark buried under years of distance and pain. Then, just as quickly, he looked away. The prosecutor began outlining the case, reading from the report with practiced precision. Marcus heard the words, witness testimony, evidence recovered, suspect identified near the scene, but they sounded distant, muffled, as if spoken underwater. His focus was on Derek's hands, trembling slightly despite his effort to stay still. It struck Marcus how easily life could rearrange 2 boys from the same street into such different positions, one behind the bench, the other behind bars. The unfairness of it scraped against everything he'd built his career on. He wanted to ask what had happened, where Derek had been all those years, whether the spark in his friend's eyes had gone out or simply dimmed. But none of that mattered here, not in this place where emotion was weakness and justice wore a blindfold. Still, as the bailiff called for order, Marcus couldn't shake the thought that fate had just thrown him a test, one he wasn't sure the law had prepared him to pass. The ride from the courthouse to the detention center was supposed to be routine, but nothing about it felt ordinary to Marcus Hill. The day had left a weight on his chest, the kind that didn't fade once the gavel fell. He told himself to focus on the law, on fairness, on distance, the armor he'd built over years of rulings and verdicts. Yet, beneath that armor, a thought gnawed at him. What happened to you, Derek? 2 days later, when the next hearing came, the same unease returned. The courtroom lights seemed harsher, the air heavier. The public defender was still fumbling through notes, clearly unprepared for a case that should never have gone to trial this quickly. Marcus watched her shuffle papers and try to sound confident, while the prosecutor stood sharp and smug, ready to make quick work of the man sitting quietly at the table. Derek hadn't changed much in 2 days, still stoic, still carrying that exhausted dignity that comes from someone too used to losing. Marcus's eyes lingered on him longer than they should have. Every movement Derek made stirred another memory, the grin he'd flash after outrunning everyone on the field, the way he'd laugh even when his shoes had holes. The man before him looked like that same boy, just beaten down by years that hadn't been kind. The prosecutor began his opening statement, voice firm and confident. Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended less than 3 blocks from the convenience store that was robbed. He matched the description provided by the store clerk. Furthermore, Marcus's pen tapped against the bench once. Just once, but it was enough to make the room still. He didn't interrupt, not yet. He simply listened, his judicial mask fixed in place, even as his gut twisted with doubt. The story was too neat, too fast. Every piece of evidence seemed to fit a little too perfectly, like a puzzle someone had forced together. When the prosecutor finished, the defense attorney stood, her hands trembling just slightly. Your Honor, she began, we intend to show that the defendant was misidentified. There were no fingerprints recovered, no DNA evidence, and... The prosecutor cut in, and yet, the stolen items were found in his possession. The young lawyer blinked, then checked her notes, clearly realizing she hadn't seen those details before. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Counselor, did you receive the evidence log? She looked up, startled. No, Your Honor, I requested it, but the police report didn't include it in the discovery packet. That was the first crack. Marcus didn't let it show on his face, but inside, something shifted. A case with missing discovery documents. That wasn't just sloppy, it was unacceptable. Mr. Dalton, Marcus said, evenly, turning to the prosecutor, can you explain why the defense has yet to receive a complete evidence log? The prosecutor straightened, clearing his throat. It must have been an oversight, Your Honor. The department's been. Fix it, Marcus interrupted, voice sharp as a blade. Now, there was a pause. The silence that followed wasn't just courtroom silence, it was heavy, watchful. Derek lifted his head for the first time that morning. Their eyes met again, and Marcus felt the same jolt as before. In that moment, Derek didn't look angry or even desperate. He looked disappointed, not in the system, but in the idea that maybe Marcus had become part of it, the same cold machinery that never cared who it crushed. Marcus's jaw tightened. He turned back to the defense. You'll receive the full evidence file by tomorrow. This court doesn't proceed on incomplete information. Yes, Your Honor, the attorney replied softly. As the hearing continued, Marcus kept listening, but something inside him had already shifted from judge to investigator. Each witness account contradicted the next. The description of the suspect's height varied by nearly a foot. The time stamps didn't line up with the arrest report. Even the camera footage, which should have been the simplest proof, was missing due to technical issues. Technical issues. Marcus had heard that phrase too many times in his career, and it almost always meant someone didn't want the footage found. When the prosecutor finished his summary, Marcus leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. I'll grant a short recess, he said. We'll reconvene once both parties have reviewed all evidence. The gavel struck, and the room slowly emptied. But Derek stayed seated, his hands resting on the table, eyes fixed forward. The bailiff waited for Marcus to rise, but he hesitated. For a moment, he wanted to speak, not as a judge, not even as an old friend, but as a man who'd seen enough to know when something wasn't right. Instead, he only said, Mr. Coleman, you'll have your fair day in court. It wasn't much, but the smallest flicker of relief crossed Derek's face, as if those words meant more than Marcus intended. When Marcus returned to his chambers, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at the case file spread open before him. The papers smelled faintly of copier ink and dust. Every page was supposed to tell a truth, but this one felt like a lie, wrapped in procedure. For the first time in years, Marcus didn't know if justice would come from the law or from his own need to make things right. Either way, he knew one thing with chilling certainty: Derek's fate would not be decided by convenience. Not this time. When the courtroom doors opened again 2 weeks later, the air felt different. There was tension, yes, but also expectation, the kind that comes when truth hovers on the edge of being revealed. Judge Marcus Hill sat in his chair with his usual composure, but inside, his mind was anything but calm. He had spent nights going over the case, line by line, pulling favors to get the missing footage that everyone else seemed too eager to forget. The more he looked, the more he saw cracks in every story told. Someone had wanted Derek to take the fall. The courtroom filled quickly that morning. Reporters lined the back row. The prosecutor, Mr. Dalton, looked uneasy for the first time since the trial began. His usual arrogance had dimmed. There was a sheen of sweat on his forehead. The defense attorney, young, nervous, but sharper now, looked as though she finally had something solid to fight with. Derek sat beside her, calmer than before. His eyes flickered toward Marcus once, a quiet acknowledgement that said more than words could. "Court is now in session," Marcus announced, voice firm, echoing through the chamber. Dalton stood first. "Your Honor, the state maintains that the evidence remains clear, Mr. Coleman was apprehended near the scene with stolen goods. The identification by the store clerk was." "Before you continue, Mr. Dalton," Marcus interrupted, his tone precise, "the court has received a copy of the surveillance footage from the convenience store. The footage previously reported missing." Dalton froze. The defense attorney's head snapped up. A ripple of murmurs filled the room. Marcus gestured to the bailiff. "Play the video." The lights dimmed slightly as the projector flickered to life. The footage was grainy, time-stamped, showing the robbery in progress. A man burst through the door wearing a black hoodie and mask, demanding cash. But as he turned toward the counter, his face came briefly into view. The robber was broader, taller, and heavier than Derek by a wide margin. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Marcus didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen. He had watched this same video alone, late one night, feeling the same shock, the same silent fury. When the lights came back on, he spoke evenly. "Mr. Dalton, can you explain to this court why this evidence was omitted from the prosecution's case?" Dalton's mouth opened, then closed. "Your Honor, I was not aware this footage was available. The police report indicated." "Enough." Marcus's voice cut through the noise. "The court will recess briefly to review the chain of custody for this evidence." He struck the gavel once, hard. When they reconvened an hour later, the truth had fully unraveled. The officer in charge of the evidence had falsified records, claiming the footage was lost. He'd been under pressure to close the case quickly, and Derek, an ex-convict with prior misdemeanors, had been the easiest target. It was the kind of lazy, cruel efficiency that Marcus had seen destroy lives before. "The court finds the charges against Derek James Coleman to be unfounded," Marcus declared at last, voice clear and unwavering. "The case is dismissed." For a moment, no one moved. Then the words sank in, and Derek's head dropped forward, his shoulders shaking once, silently. The bailiff stepped toward him, removing the cuffs. The clink of metal against wood echoed like a final punctuation mark. Derek stood slowly, his eyes glistening as he looked toward Marcus. Outside, reporters shouted questions, flashes went off, but Derek ignored them. He stepped down the courthouse steps, the sunlight blinding after weeks of confinement. Marcus followed a few steps behind, not as a judge now, but as a man who needed to say something, anything, to bridge 15 years of silence. "Derek," he called quietly. Derek turned. For a second, he looked uncertain, almost like that boy from long ago, the one who'd once thrown a football too hard and laughed when it hit Marcus square in the chest. "Didn't think I'd see you again, man," Derek said softly. Marcus exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Guess fate had other plans. They stood there, in that moment between past and present, between guilt and forgiveness. The courthouse loomed behind them, tall and cold, but somehow it didn't feel as heavy as before. "You ever think," Derek said, "how different things could have been if we'd both caught a break back then?" "All the time," Marcus replied. There was no apology, no need for one. The truth was enough. Derek reached out, shaking Marcus's hand, his grip firm but tired. Then he nodded toward the street. "I think I'm done running, Marcus. I just want to build something again. Something real." Marcus hesitated, then smiled faintly. "You should come by next week. There's a position open in the courthouse library, archival work, steady hours. You'd be good at it." Derek blinked, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face before a smile slowly broke through. "You serious?" "Absolutely." When Derek walked away that day, the autumn wind caught the edge of his jacket, and for the first time in years, he walked without looking over his shoulder. Marcus watched him disappear into the crowd, a single man reclaiming the rhythm of his own steps. Back inside, the courtroom stood empty again, sunlight pouring across the bench where justice had finally done something right, not by the book, but by the heart. Marcus sat for a long while before whispering to the silence, "Sometimes the law catches up. Sometimes it just has to remember who it's for."